So where does that leave things right now? Venezuela is still in the middle of an active humanitarian catastrophe, with search and rescue teams from dozens of countries working through rubble under increasingly difficult conditions, and the true death toll likely won't be fully known for weeks or months. Japan just demonstrated for the second time in 15 years that decades of investment in building codes, early warning technology, and public education can take an earthquake that would devastate almost anywhere else on the planet and turn it into a matter of a few minor injuries. California sits in the most uncertain position of the three, carrying real infrastructure and warning systems, but also carrying a fault system that new physics-based research says is more critically stressed than at any point in the last 1,000 years, sitting directly beneath more than 20 million people. None of these earthquakes caused each other. The Ring of Fire simply never stops moving, and it never will. The only real variable left in this story is not geology, it's preparation. And that is something governments, engineers, and individual people are still deciding right now before the next rupture arrives. The planet has been doing this for billions of years, long before any building code existed, and it will keep doing it long after we are gone. What changes the outcome is what gets built and practiced in the quiet years before the ground moves. The North Anatolian Fault runs roughly 20 kilometers south of the city, and it is one of the best studied strike-slip faults on the planet, having produced a remarkably consistent sequence of major ruptures throughout the 20th century that marched steadily westward across Turkey. The most recent major event in that sequence was the 1999 Izmit earthquake, a magnitude 7, 6 disaster that killed more than 17,000 people. The next segment in line, the section running beneath the Sea of Marmara just south of Istanbul, has not ruptured since 1766. Over 250 years of accumulated tectonic stress. Researchers at Germany's GFZ Research Center have estimated that this section alone needs to slip nearly 4.5 meters to release everything currently stored inside it. In April of last year, a magnitude 6, 2 earthquake in the Sea of Marmara sent hundreds of people to hospitals and triggered mass panic in the middle of the night without causing a single death, a preview of what the city lives under constantly. Some estimates place the probability of a magnitude 7. 3 or larger earthquakes striking beneath Istanbul within the next 3 decades at close to a coin flip, and roughly a third of that window has already passed. It's worth taking a moment to explain why a jump from magnitude 7, 2 to 7. 5 sounds small on paper, but is anything but small in reality. The moment magnitude scale used by USGS and virtually every international seismic agency is logarithmic, not linear. Each full step up the scale represents roughly a 10-fold increase in the amplitude of ground shaking, and about 31 times more energy released. That means a magnitude 7. 5, earthquake does not release slightly more energy than a magnitude 6. 5, it releases somewhere in the range of 31 times more. Push that difference from 6 to 8, and you're looking at roughly a 1,000-fold increase in energy. In practical terms, a magnitude 6 earthquake releases energy comparable to around 15,000 tons of TNT detonating underground. A magnitude 7 releases something closer to the equivalent of 38 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. This is exactly why Venezuela's 7. 5, main shock, occurring at a shallow depth of only about 10 kilometers directly beneath populated coastal areas, proved so catastrophic, while a similarly sized event at greater depth or in a remote location might barely register as news at all. Magnitude alone never tells the whole story. Depth, fault mechanism, proximity to population centers, local soil conditions, and the quality of the built environment above the rupture all matter just as much, sometimes more. One of the genuine bright spots in modern earthquake science has nothing to do with predicting when the ground will move, since that remains scientifically impossible, and everything to do with the handful of seconds between when a rupture begins and when the destructive shaking actually arrives. When a fault ruptures, it sends out 2 types of waves. Fast-moving primary waves that carry relatively little destructive energy, and slower secondary waves that carry the violent shaking responsible for most structural damage. Earthquake early warning systems detect that first, faster wave the instant a rupture begins, and use the gap before the damaging waves arrive to push out an alert. It sounds like almost nothing, but 10 to 20 seconds of warning is enough time to drop and take cover under sturdy furniture, enough time for a surgeon to pause a delicate procedure, enough time for a bullet train to begin emergency braking before reaching a bridge or tunnel, and enough time for elevators to stop at the nearest floor and open their doors before people get trapped inside. Japan has operated an early warning system since 2007, refining it continuously, and it is precisely why alerts reached the population within seconds during the April Sanriku earthquake. California's Shake Alert system, built by the USGS, now performs a similar role statewide. Venezuela, by contrast, had no comparable early warning infrastructure in place on June 24th. There was no alert and no advance notice before the shaking began, and that absence is a large part of why the outcome there looked so different from Japan's. There are also concrete, unglamorous steps that make a measurable difference no matter where you live, and they do not require waiting on a government program. Having a few days of stored water, non-perishable food, a working flashlight, and any essential medications set aside is one of the simplest ways to buy yourself time if utilities go down for an extended stretch. Knowing exactly where your home's gas shutoff valve is located and how to use it can prevent the kind of fires that so often follow major shaking once ruptured gas lines meet damaged electrical systems. Securing heavy furniture and water heaters to wall studs and anchoring bookshelves so they cannot topple onto a bed or a doorway addresses one of the leading causes of earthquake injuries, which is not collapsing buildings, but falling objects inside rooms that otherwise survive intact. Agreeing on a family communication plan in advance matters enormously too, since mobile networks are often among the first systems to fail, exactly as they did across large parts of Venezuela within minutes of the June 24th rupture. None of this requires expensive retrofitting or waiting for a new building code cycle. It requires an afternoon, and it is precisely the kind of preparation that separated Japan's outcome from Venezuela's far more than luck ever did. 6 megapascals of stress, the highest value in the entire simulation, while the Mojave South segment of the San Andreas registered true power 2. 8 megapascals, also a record for that section. But the more striking discovery in this research involves a location called Cajon Pass, roughly 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles, where the San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems physically converge. The researchers describe this junction as an earthquake gate, a point capable of either stopping a rupture in its tracks or allowing it to jump from one fault system onto the other, turning what would otherwise be a single fault earthquake into a combined far larger event. By studying 1,000 years of past ruptures, the team found that earthquakes historically crossed through Cajon Pass whenever the stress levels on both sides of the junction were closely matched. Previously, ruptures were shown to jump the gate when the stress difference between the two fault segments dropped to around 0, 3 megapascals. Right now, that gap measures roughly 0. 8 megapascals in closing. According to Burkhardt, that is precisely the configuration the region is approaching today. In 1812, a magnitude 7. 5 earthquake known as the Wrightwood earthquake is believed to have done exactly this, crossing the Cajon Pass and rupturing both fault systems simultaneously, killing 40 people in a region that, at the time, held a tiny fraction of its current population. If a joint rupture through Cajon Pass happened today, researchers estimate the resulting earthquake could measure somewhere between magnitude 7, 4, and 7, 8, and it would not stay contained to one narrow corridor. It would threaten the Los Angeles Basin, San Bernardino, Riverside County, and the Coachella Valley simultaneously, an area now home to well over 20 million people. USGS geologist Kate Scherer, a co-author on the study, has pointed out that because so much time has passed since either fault system last had a major rupture, the accumulated stress across the region is enormous. Burkhardt herself has been direct that this is not a prediction of exactly when an earthquake will strike, since earthquake timing remains scientifically impossible to forecast, but that the physics-based modeling gives scientists and emergency planners a far clearer picture of just how critically loaded the system currently is. California has made real progress since the last major quake era. The Shake Alert early warning system is now active statewide, pushing alerts through the MyShake app and giving people up to tens of seconds of notice before major shaking arrives, and it already successfully detected and alerted for a magnitude 5. 7 event near Silver Springs, Nevada earlier this year. Building codes for new construction are strong, and the state adopted an updated seismic hazard mapping standard at the start of 2026. But retrofitting older vulnerable buildings, particularly the thousands of soft-story apartment complexes built in the 1960s and 70s, has moved slowly, and funding for preparedness in lower-income communities remains inconsistent. Now, the natural instinct when you line up Venezuela, Japan, and California side by side, and then add the Philippines getting hit by a magnitude 6. 5, Papua New Guinea rattled by its own tremor sequence, and Nicaragua registering a 5. 2, all in overlapping weeks, is to ask whether the planet itself has become more seismically active. The Philippines sits at the junction of several converging plates along the western edge of the Ring of Fire and experiences frequent moderate to strong shaking almost every year, with building codes and public awareness that vary enormously between wealthier urban centers and poorer rural provinces. Papua New Guinea sits along one of the most tectonically complicated stretches of crust on the planet, where multiple small plates and microplates collide, which is part of why the region produces such a high frequency of moderate to large earthquakes, with relatively little global media coverage, compared to disasters in more populated areas. Nicaragua sits along the Middle America Trench, where the Cocos Plate subducts beneath the Caribbean Plate, a system that has produced deadly earthquakes in the past, including a devastating 1972 quake that leveled much of the capital, Managua. None of these events are connected to each other in any causal sense. Earth produces thousands of earthquakes every single day, the overwhelming majority too small to ever be felt. Earthquakes of magnitude 6 or larger happen somewhere on the planet roughly 120 to 140 times a year, which works out to about 1 every 3 days. Seeing several significant earthquakes cluster in the same week is statistically expected, not some kind of anomaly. And critically, these fault systems do not talk to each other. Venezuela sits on the boundary between the Caribbean and South American plates, a transform system running east to west across the northern edge of the continent. Japan sits on a subduction zone, where the Pacific plate dives beneath microplates tied to the North American and Eurasian plates. These are geologically independent systems, separated by thousands of kilometers, and there is no scientific mechanism by which an earthquake in one triggered an earthquake in the other. What connects nearly all of these events is something simpler: the Pacific Ring of Fire, a horseshoe-shaped arc of tectonic boundaries roughly 40,000 kilometers long that wraps around almost the entire Pacific Ocean. Japan, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, California, Mexico, Chile, and New Zealand all sit on or near it, and the Ring of Fire is responsible for something like 90% of the world's earthquakes and roughly 75% of its active volcanoes. It never actually stops being active. What has changed over the last several decades is not the geology, it is the number of people now living directly in its path. And more importantly, the condition of the buildings and infrastructure those people are living inside. The global urban population has exploded over the past 70 years, and a huge share of that growth has concentrated in coastal megacities, sitting near active fault zones, places like Tokyo, Jakarta, Manila, Los Angeles, Mexico City, Lima, and Istanbul. The geological risk to these cities was never really in question. What has always been in question is how prepared the buildings and the people inside them are for the moment the ground finally moves. Speaking of cities that scientists watch with quiet dread, it's worth mentioning Istanbul, Turkey, home to more than 16 million people. On April 20th, 2026, a magnitude 7, 4 earthquakes struck roughly 100 kilometers off the coast of Miyako in Iwate Prefecture, along the Japan Trench, the same subduction zone that produced the catastrophic 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. Japan's own meteorological agency initially measured the event at 7 before the final assessment settled closer to 7. 4 to 7, 5, depending on the model used. The shaking was felt from Hokkaido in the north down through central Japan, meaning tens of millions of people felt the ground move. A CNN producer, reporting live from Tokyo, described feeling their building sway for nearly 7 minutes straight. Within moments, Japan's meteorological agency issued a 3-meter tsunami warning across Iwate, Aomori, and Hokkaido prefectures. More than 180,000 people were ordered to evacuate to higher ground. The actual tsunami that arrived peaked at just 80 centimeters at Kujiport, far below the worst-case forecast, and the warning was downgraded and lifted within hours. The final damage report from a magnitude 7.4 earthquake that triggered a full tsunami warning across a country of 125 million people. 2 people injured from falls, roughly 200 power outages, 26 non-residential buildings damaged, and 0 deaths. Read that again. A shallow, powerful earthquake along one of the most dangerous fault systems on the planet, and the confirmed toll was 2 minor injuries. Compare that to Venezuela's outcome from a nearly identical magnitude event, and you start to understand that the difference has almost nothing to do with the strength of the shaking itself. Japan sits at the meeting point of 4 tectonic plates: the Pacific, the North American, the Eurasian, and the Philippine Sea Plate, and it experiences somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 felt earthquakes every single year. It accounts for roughly 10% of the entire planet's earthquakes and close to 18 to 20% of all magnitude 6 or larger events anywhere on Earth. This is not a country that occasionally deals with earthquakes. It is a country built around the permanent expectation of them. After the April quake, Japanese authorities issued what is called a megaquake advisory, a formal statement that the short-term probability of a magnitude 8 or larger earthquake had temporarily risen roughly tenfold from a background rate of about 0. 1% up to around 1% over the following week. Officials were careful to stress this is not a prediction of an exact event, simply a statistically elevated window of risk, and residents across 182 coastal towns in 7 prefectures were asked to confirm their evacuation routes as a precaution, not out of panic. The reason the outcome in Japan looked nothing like the outcome in Venezuela comes down to decades of deliberate investment. Japan enforces some of the strictest seismic building codes on Earth, and those codes are updated continuously as new research comes in. Structures are engineered to flex and sway rather than resist and shatter. Base isolation systems, essentially giant shock-absorbing foundations, are standard in major buildings. High-speed rail lines, including the Shinkansen, are wired to automatic seismic sensors that halt trains the instant unusual ground motion is detected, which is exactly why a Sanriku railway train carrying 9 passengers came to a safe stop inside a tunnel during the April quake without a single injury. Nuclear facilities along the coast, including the still decommissioning Fukushima site, reported 0 abnormalities. From elementary school onward, Japanese children run earthquake drills until the correct response becomes automatic muscle memory rather than something they have to think through in the moment. 15 years after the 2011 Tohoku disaster killed close to 16,000 people along this same coastline, a smaller but still extremely powerful earthquake struck the same fault system and killed nobody. That is not luck. That is what sustained preparation across generations actually buys a country. So now let's talk about California, because the science that came out this past June is genuinely one of the more unsettling pieces of earthquake research in recent memory. A team led by geophysicist Liliane Burkhardt of the University of Bern, working alongside researchers from the University of Hawaii, the USGS Earthquake Science Center in Pasadena, and Scripps Institution of Oceanography, published a study in the Journal of Geophysical Research. Solid Earth examining exactly how much stress has built up along the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems. To understand why this matters, you need to understand how faults actually work. 2 sections of crust are trying to slide past each other, but friction locks them together near the surface. The plates keep moving deeper down, so the locked section simply accumulates stored elastic energy instead of releasing it. That stress builds for years, decades, sometimes centuries, until it finally exceeds the strength of the rock holding it in place. And then the fault slips all at once, releasing everything stored up in a single earthquake. The southern San Andreas fault last ruptured in a major event back in 1857, the Fort Tejon earthquake, estimated at roughly magnitude 7.9. That is 169 years of the Pacific and North American plates grinding past each other at around 5 centimeters a year, with no major release along this particular stretch. Burkhardt's team built a physics-based 4-dimensional computer model simulating a full 1,000 years of earthquake history along both fault systems, feeding it radiocarbon dating of shifted sediment layers, tree ring records of historical ground ruptures, and centuries of documented seismic activity, then running it forward to estimate present-day stress. They're finding stress on multiple fault segments is now sitting at or above the highest levels recorded anywhere in that 1,000-year reconstruction. The San Jacinto Bernardino segment alone registered 3. Earthquakes all over the planet. Venezuela, California, Japan. What is happening right now? At 6:04 in the evening on June 24th, 2026, the ground beneath northwestern Venezuela tore open. A magnitude 7. 2 earthquakes struck near the town of Yumare, west of San Felipe. 39 seconds later, before anyone could even process what had just happened, a second and far more violent rupture hit the exact same region, this time measuring 7. 5. Scientists call this an earthquake doublet, 2 nearly identical seismic events sharing almost the same epicenter and the same underground signature. And it is one of the rarest and most destructive patterns in all of seismology. Within minutes, the coastal state of La Guaira had lost an estimated 80% of its buildings. Caracas shook for a full 60 seconds. Hospitals closed, cell networks collapsed. And by the time international rescue teams landed, the death toll was already climbing past anything Venezuela had experienced in more than 100 years. That was 3 weeks ago. As you are reading this, the number of confirmed dead has climbed past 3,800 people, with more than 16,700 injured and tens of thousands still unaccounted for. And Venezuela is only one piece of a much bigger and stranger picture. In the same stretch of months, Japan recorded a magnitude 7 for earthquake off its northeastern coast that triggered a full tsunami warning for millions of people. California scientists just published a study concluding that the San Andreas fault system has reached its highest stress level in 1,000 years. The Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and Nicaragua were all shaken in overlapping weeks. Something is clearly happening across the planet's fault lines all at once. And today, we're breaking down exactly what is going on, why some of these earthquakes killed almost nobody, while one of them may end up being one of the deadliest disasters of the decade, and what the science actually says about what comes next. No exaggeration, no doomsday theatrics, just the facts and the stakes behind them. Let's start with Venezuela, because what happened there on June 24th deserves to be understood in full, not just as a headline. The United States Geological Survey traced both earthquakes to the Boconó Fault System, a network of fractures running southwest to northeast across northwestern Venezuela, close to where it intersects the east-west-oriented San Sebastian Fault. Together, these faults form the strike-slip boundary where the Caribbean tectonic plate grinds sideways past the South American plate. The first quake, at magnitude 7, 2 ruptured at a depth of about 20 kilometers. Geologists believe that rupture increased stress on a second, shallower fault segment sitting only about 10 kilometers below the surface, and 39 seconds later that segment gave way at magnitude 7. 5. This is why depth matters so much in earthquake science. When a rupture happens far underground, the rock between the fault and the surface absorbs a huge portion of the seismic energy before it ever reaches a building. When a rupture is shallow, as this one was, nearly all of that energy slams directly into whatever is sitting above it. And in La Guaira and Caracas, what was sitting above it were decades of deferred maintenance, informal construction, and buildings that were never engineered to survive a major seismic event. Venezuela was already in crisis before the ground ever moved. The country had been under years of economic collapse, hyperinflation, and political instability, and nearly 6 million people were already living in need of humanitarian assistance before June 24th. Construction oversight in lower-income neighborhoods, which also happened to be the most densely populated, had been minimal for years. So, when the two ruptures hit back-to-back, buildings that should have flexed simply came down. Officials initially reported around 250 structures destroyed. Satellite analysis using NASA imagery later suggested the real number was closer to 59,000 buildings damaged or destroyed, including hospitals and schools. The United Nations Development Program estimated direct physical losses at close to $7 billion. Roughly 6% of Venezuela's entire economy, gone in under a minute of shaking. Other estimates that include full infrastructure losses put the number as high as $37 billion. The human side of this disaster is what makes it almost impossible to look away from. Reporters on the ground describe people throwing themselves to the floor and praying because it was the only thing left to do. Families in Spain, Chile, and Florida spent days searching social media for any sign of relatives trapped under collapsed apartment blocks, some of which required cranes that rescue teams simply did not have enough of. 8 hospitals in and around Caracas were forced to close entirely due to structural damage, forcing patients to be transferred to facilities that were already overwhelmed. More than 600 aftershocks have been recorded since the initial rupture, including one on June 26th that collapsed a bridge in La Guaira that rescue vehicles were using to reach survivors. The United Nations and Venezuelan authorities together ordered 10,000 body bags in anticipation of the death toll climbing further, and as of the most recent update, more than 40,000 people remain missing. Venezuela's own media restrictions, including blocks on hundreds of websites and social platforms, have made it extraordinarily difficult for families abroad to even confirm whether loved ones are alive, prompting direct appeals from the United Nations for the government to restore access to information during the crisis. This is a nation already stretched to its limit, now facing what may become one of the deadliest natural disasters anywhere in the world this decade. Now here is where the story gets genuinely important, because less than 1,000 miles from the Ring of Fire's edge, and in the exact same general window of time, Japan experienced an earthquake of almost identical strength, and the outcome could not have been more different